Welcome to the latest episode of the Real World Nutrition Podcast. This is episode 252. Heart disease is still the number one killer. Are we making progress? Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Real World Nutrition. I'm Shelley Rael, registered dietitian nutritionist. And today's episode is one that I've wanted to cover for a while because it touches on something that almost everyone has heard. Heart disease is the number one cause of death in the United States. Now, you may or may not have heard this before, and you may or may not have heard that this has been true for over 100 years. And this raises a couple of questions. If we've known this for so long, if we have known and heart disease has been the number one cause of death for more than 100 years, why is it still the number one cause of death? If we know so much more about nutrition, exercise, cholesterol, blood pressure, medications, and prevention than we did decades ago, are we actually making any progress, or are we just spinning our wheels? And the answer is yes, we are making progress. And in fact, we've made tremendous progress. But it is a little bit more complicated than just saying or simply saying that heart disease is still number one, therefore nothing is working. So I want to address today what has improved in relation to heart disease and what hasn't, and what all of this means to us as individuals. As always, I'll link the companion blog in the show notes, so if you'd like a little more detail after you've listened to this. But I really want to start here first, what we actually mean when we say heart disease. And that's one thing that often gets overlooked, is that heart disease isn't one disease. It's a really broad category. Most of the time when people use the term heart disease, they're talking about cardiovascular disease, and that includes conditions such as coronary artery disease, heart attacks, heart failure, strokes, and diseases involving the heart and blood vessels. And many of these conditions share common risk factors and in many cases common underlying processes. One of the biggest is something called atherosclerosis. Now that's a big word and not everybody fully comprehends what that means, but it is pretty straightforward. And so let me give you an analogy to help better understand this. So imagine driving on the interstate. Traffic is flowing normally. Then one lane closes and cars start slowing down. And then another lane closes. Traffic gets more backed up. Now, imagine both of those lanes closed and then there's an accident that blocks the entire highway. Everything comes to a stop. Atherosclerosis works somewhat like that. Over time, plaque builds up inside the arteries. And as plaque accumulates, that opening becomes narrower. So think of the lane closures. Blood can still move through, but not as efficiently. And then if a plaque ruptures and a clot forms, blood flow can become partially or completely blocked. And when that blockage happens to an artery that is supplying the heart, so we have arteries around the heart, that's a heart attack. If it happens in an artery that's supplying the brain, so the blood vessels that go to the brain, if that's a blockage there, that can lead to a stroke. And obviously this is a simplified explanation, but it really helps people visualize what is happening. And then this is something that's really important. This process often develops over many years, not days, not weeks, years, sometimes decades. So this means people can have developing cardiovascular disease without realizing it. And one of the questions that I hear from people, or comments I should say, is, I feel fine. And that's great. I hope you do. But unfortunately, feeling fine doesn't necessarily tell us what is happening inside the body. High blood pressure often has no symptoms. High cholesterol usually has no symptoms. Early atherosclerosis generally has no symptoms. Someone may feel completely healthy until something significant happens. And that's one reason routine screening is so important. Checking cholesterol, checking blood pressure, checking glucose. Sometimes additional tests are appropriate depending on someone's individual risk. And the goal there isn't to find problems. The goal is to identify risk early enough that something can be done about it. Because preventing a heart attack is generally preferable to treating one after it's happened. So now I want to go back to the original question. Has heart disease always been the leading cause of death? For the most part, yes. There have been a few exceptions. So during the influenza pandemic of 1918 and 1919, so more than 100 years ago, influenza briefly became the leading cause of death. More recently, during the COVID-19 pandemic, COVID became the third leading cause of death, while heart disease and cancer remained the top two. So despite everything that's changed in medicine, heart disease has remained at the top for a very long time. But here's the part that's encouraging. That doesn't mean nothing has improved. Actually, quite a bit has. And one of the biggest improvements has been survival. If someone has a heart attack today, their chances of surviving are much better than they were several decades ago. Emergency medical systems have improved. People receive treatment more quickly. Hospitals have better technology. We have procedures like angioplasty and stent placement that can restore blood flow. Bypass surgery has become much more refined. We have medications that weren't available years ago. Statins, blood pressure medications, blood thinners, newer therapies that continue to improve outcomes. And when you put all those advances together, they make a tremendous difference. People who might not have survived a heart attack decades ago often do today. And that's incredible progress. And that's easy to overlook when we tend to focus on the headline that heart disease is still number one. But survival rates tell another story. Medicine has come a long way. Another area where we've made progress is screening. Today, routine cholesterol testing is common. Blood pressure measurements happen almost every time you visit a healthcare provider. Blood glucose testing is widely available. Depending on someone's situation, there may also be additional tools that help assess cardiovascular risk. Things like coronary artery calcium scoring or inflammatory markers may be appropriate for certain individuals. These aren't tests for everyone's needs, so that doesn't mean everyone needs to start asking for the coronary artery calcium scoring. But they give healthcare providers more information than they had decades ago, so it's okay to ask. It just may be you're not quite there yet, or the risk isn't there for you yet. The earlier someone knows they're at increased risk, the more opportunities there are to reduce that risk. And again, that's progress. Now here's a big one. In the world we live in today, not everybody remembers this. Smoking is an area where we've seen meaningful improvements. We've known for a long time that smoking is one of the biggest risk factors for cardiovascular disease. The good news is that smoking rates in the United States have declined substantially over the years, and that decline has undoubtedly contributed to improvements in heart health. Now, we know that doesn't mean tobacco has disappeared, far from it. We have newer products like the e-cigarettes and vaping devices, and those raise their own questions, particularly regarding long-term health effects. We're still learning about many of those, but reducing cigarette smoking has been one of the major public health successes related to heart disease. We've also learned much more about nutrition and lifestyle. When I first became interested in nutrition and started out in the education area of this, many of the focus was centered around individual nutrients. People focused on fat or cholesterol or carbohydrates or sodium. And today we're still talking about those things, but we've shifted much towards the overall eating patterns, and that's a big change. So instead of asking whether one food is good or bad, we're asking what someone's overall eating pattern looks like. Are they eating fruits and vegetables regularly, whole grains, protein from a variety of sources, healthy fats? I spend quite a bit of time covering some of these topics over the past month, not necessarily on the podcast yet, but in the blogs. So including healthy fats, addressing processed meats, addressing food variety. And all of this fits into a bigger picture of cardiovascular health. It's rarely one food, it's usually the overall pattern. So if we've made all these advancements in medicine, screening, and treatment, why is heart disease still the leading cause of death? Well, I think there's a few reasons. First, while treatment has improved tremendously, prevention is much harder. Think about it this way. If someone arrives at the hospital having a heart attack, we have tools to help them. We can restore blood flow, stabilize the patient, prescribe medications, and significantly improve their chances of survival. That's amazing. But preventing that heart attack from happening in the first place requires something completely different. It often requires years of healthy habits, not days, not weeks, years. And that's much more difficult for humans in general. We all know that eating more fruits and vegetables is generally a good idea. Most people know they should be physically active. Most people know that smoking increases health risk. Knowing what to do and consistently doing it are two very different things. And this isn't a criticism, this isn't a judgment, this is reality. Health behaviors don't happen in a vacuum. They're influenced by our schedule, finances, stress levels, sleep, access to healthcare, food availability, family responsibilities, and so many other factors. So while medicine has become very good at treating disease, preventing disease often requires changes that are much harder to sustain over time. Another challenge is that many of the major risk factors remain incredibly common. Obesity rates continue to be high. Physical inactivity is still common. Many dietary patterns fall short of recommendations. Conditions like high blood pressure, elevated cholesterol, and type 2 diabetes affect millions of Americans, and all of these contribute to cardiovascular disease risk. Now notice I said contribute. None of these guarantees someone will develop heart disease. And the opposite is true as well, and I want to make this clear. The opposite is true as well. Someone who exercises regularly and eats a nutritious diet isn't guaranteed, they are not guaranteed they won't develop heart disease. Genetics plays a role. Age plays a role. Family history plays a role. Certain medical conditions increase risk. And this isn't about blame, even though sometimes we want to blame our parents for those genetics and family history. But we want to focus on understanding that risk comes from many different factors working together, and it's not just diet, exercise, and weight. And that brings me to something that I think is really important. Heart disease doesn't only affect one type of person. Sometimes we picture someone who is older, or someone who carries excess body weight, or someone who has smoked for years. And as I said, those certainly can be risk factors. But risk isn't always obvious. I've known people who've looked very healthy on the outside, but had extremely high cholesterol. Others had high blood pressure and had no idea because they felt completely normal, at least in their view. I've also seen people with a strong family history of heart disease who developed cardiovascular disease despite doing many things right. That's why routine screenings matter. You cannot feel your cholesterol. You generally can't feel high blood pressure. You don't necessarily know if your blood glucose is elevated. That's why we measure them. Knowing your numbers gives you information you simply can't get by looking in the mirror or judging how you feel. So what can we actually do? I always like to focus on practical things, realistic things, real world things, not because any one thing is a magic solution, but because small actions repeated consistently really do matter over time. And the first is simple. Know your numbers. If it's been a while since you've had your cholesterol checked, ask your healthcare provider whether it's time. Know your blood pressure. Know your glucose. Depending on your age, family history, and other risk factors, there may be additional screening tests that are appropriate, And the important thing is to have the conversation. So I can make some recommendations, but really it is individualized based on you and your personal history. The earlier risk factors identified, the more options you have to address it, the less invasive it can be to address it. Next, think about your overall eating pattern. And notice I didn't say think about one food or one nutrient or one supplement. And I've talked about this quite a bit over the last several episodes. Healthy eating isn't determined by one meal or one ingredient or whether you occasionally eat dessert. It's about what happens most of the time. Are fruits and vegetables showing up regularly? Are whole grains included? Are you getting protein from a variety of sources? Are more of your fats coming from foods like nuts, seeds, fatty fish, avocados, and plant oils than from foods high in saturated fat? And here I'm talking about patterns, not rules, because that's what the evidence consistently supports. People don't eat nutrients, or I should say they do eat nutrients, but we don't think of them as nutrients. We eat meals, we eat foods, and those foods work together as part of an overall dietary pattern. Physical activity is another important piece. And again, I don't want people to hear this and think they need to start training for a marathon. Regular movement matters. Walking counts, gardening counts, strength training counts, playing with your kids or grandkids count. And the goal isn't here to become an elite athlete. It's to move your body consistently. Some movement is almost always better than none. And if you're already active, great, keep it up. Now, something people don't tend to think of is sleep and stress when we're talking about heart disease. These sometimes get pushed aside because they don't seem as directly connected to heart disease as cholesterol and blood pressure. But they do matter. Poor sleep can influence blood pressure, blood glucose regulation, appetite, and many other aspects of health. Chronic stress can also affect health in multiple ways. Now, none of us is going to eliminate stress completely. That's not even realistic. But finding healthy ways to manage stress can be one more piece of supporting cardiovascular health. And of course, avoiding tobacco remains one of the biggest things you can do for your health. If you currently smoke, quitting can substantially reduce your cardiovascular risk over time. If you don't smoke, obviously don't start. It's one of the clearest recommendations we have. And alcohol deserves some attention as well. For years, people have heard that a little red wine might be good for the heart. The research has become a little bit more nuanced. Today, we know alcohol isn't something people should start drinking for health benefits. If you don't drink, there isn't a cardiovascular reason to begin. If you do drink, keeping it within recommended limits is important. Now, before I wrap up here, I want to circle back to the question I started with. Are we making progress? Absolutely. People survive heart attacks today who might not have survived them decades ago. We have better emergency care, better medications, better procedures, better screening, and a much better understanding of the factors that influence cardiovascular health. And these are tremendous accomplishments. At the same time, heart disease remains the leading cause of death, and that tells us something important. Treatment has advanced tremendously. Prevention still has room to improve. Unfortunately, many of the things that reduce risk aren't mysterious. They're not mysteries. They're not unknown to us. They're the same healthy habits we talked about throughout this podcast, throughout all kinds of nutrition education, lifestyle education, wellness education, heart disease education. Eating a balanced dietary pattern that includes plenty of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, protein from a variety of sources, and mostly unsaturated fats. Being physically active, not smoking, getting enough sleep, managing stress, and knowing your numbers through regular screening. None of those eliminates risk entirely. There are factors we can't control, but they do help shift the odds in our favor. And that's really what prevention is all about, not finding one magic food, not eliminate one ingredient, not chasing the latest health trend. It's about building habits that support health over the long term. And one more thing I want to mention. We're all going to die eventually, and we're all going to die as a result of something eventually. So heart disease can be the leading cause of death still, but we have people who are dying in their 90s, 80s, even past 100 years old. So heart disease may be what takes them as well, but they're living so much longer. We're living so much longer. So again, we have to die from something. So heart disease is probably still going to stay at the top of the list. All right. So if you'd like more detail on today's topic, including more information about cardiovascular disease, screening, and research behind those recommendations, I have linked the companion blog in the show notes. And you'll also find links to several of the related articles and podcast episodes that I've discussed through this month, including a blog that I've written this week about healthy fats, the podcast about red meat and processed meats, and then again, another blog that I wrote this past week about overall eating patterns mattering more than focusing on individual foods. All right, with that, as always, if you found this episode helpful, I would appreciate if you would subscribe, leave a rating or review, and share this podcast with someone who might enjoy it or at least learn something from it. Thanks so much for listening. Till next time, remember, nutrition doesn't have to be complicated. It's the small, consistent choices that really do add up over time. And with that, everyone, you take care and bye for now.